it will. But I think the bigger thing is something and it's an expression I gleaned from one of my long-term clients about being kind to your future self. So, if it was me talking about it, is I've got to think about what is going to make life easier or harder for future David.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of embracing that, because part of not having these conversations is you don't want to have it because it's uncomfortable. But then what happens when you're dealing with late cancellations or no-shows or a balance being run up? Then you've just created more work for future David or future James.
Because you didn't want to have that uncomfortable.
Because you didn't want to have that. And
yeah.
So it is, to a certain extent, it's, like the proverb, eating the frog. If you've got to eat a frog, go on and get it done.
Welcome back to the Scaling Therapy Practice. In this episode, we're going to talk about setting up financial boundaries with your clients. David and I talk a lot about the benefit that these boundaries will provide for you and your practice. One of the big benefits is you're more financially secure when you're collecting your payments. You have a system for auditing. You have a system for making sure the reimbursements are going in and you're having some checks and balances. I once worked with a therapist, and I think I tell the story in the episode, where they knew they were having payment errors with certain insurance companies. And instead of solving those and trying to figure out the cause of that and preventing them and getting ahead of it, what this poor man did was he said, well, I'll just work harder. I'll see more clients. And after a couple of years, he realized he had thousands and thousands of dollars of uncollected payments that he's never going to get. And he was running out of time and energy to make the money he wanted. So then he reached out to our company to help him with virtual assistant services. But missing those payments can be a financial burden. Another benefit of the policies is not having to work out what you need to do over and over again. There's a lot of angst when you come to an unknown situation and you don't know what you do. So if you have it written down, then you are able to follow your policy, and you don't have to churn over, should I do this, shouldn't I do that? Set your policy, write it, and follow it. And that also helps your clients know their limits. There are some people, probably like me, who would not push the boundaries too far. You tell me the limit, or I assume a limit, I'm not going to take advantage of anything. And then there's other people, their philosophy is totally different. Their philosophy is, I'm going to push until they say no. And so you have to figure out where your no is and put it down in paper. Not for everybody, but for some of the people who will push until they hear a no. And then finally, the no-show policy and some of these other financial policies help with cancellations. If you're able to charge no-show policy fees, figure out a way that is reasonable and balanced. I think David talks about how he think they charge like half, because you can still get work done during that time for the no-show, no cancellation, but you're still using that time. It's interesting. Time for a therapist for a set appointment. It's like produce at the grocery store. Once it goes past its due date, it's no good. And so once your time is gone, you can't use it for anything. So it's sort of like spoils on the shelf. And so have a policy to mitigate some of those spoilages. It'll serve you it'll serve you in the long run for having those policies in place. All right, well, let's get on with the show with some of our tips on setting boundaries with clients, especially around financial areas.
Psych Maven is proud to support the Scaling Therapy Practice podcast. And if you are someone looking for ideas that are tailored to your own personal style on how to scale and grow your own impact and income as a mental health provider, we hope you might check out our free online assessment. If you go to stp.psychmaven.com, you can take our free personal inventory and find out what your builder type is as a helping professional. This assessment is quick and fun, and it comes with tons of customized resources with your results, so you can discover the best ways to scale that match your own personality. Find the assessment at stp.psychmaven.com. That is stp.psychmaven.com. Have fun with it.
Hello, this is James Marland with the Scaling Therapy Practice, and I'm with Dr. David Hall. Hello, David.
Hey, James. Hey, James.
Hi, glad to see you today. This week, we're going to be talking about financial boundaries with clients and some of the policies and procedures to put in place to help with that. I'm very excited to talk about that. But first, we're going to talk about our tool, tip, or tech of the week. I'm going to go first. This week, I went to the Philadelphia car show. My sister-in-law gave us some tickets, and I went with my son, his girlfriend, and my wife. And you may or may not know this about me, but I could probably walk through the car show for about an hour and be done. Like, I'm not super into cars, but I went to do it to be with the family and to be with my son. He's 18, and he's going to be moving out soon, eventually. And
Maybe.
as I was talking about that, I'm like, what, is he? Isn't he? I don't know. Like, but the children years are slowly going away.
Mm-hmm.
The adult years and transformation is coming, and he's becoming a young man. And I'm not going to have too many more of these episodes where I get to go and, hang out. So even an hour and a half car ride and enduring, $15 sub sandwiches and $5 drinks and $42 parking and enduring all that, it was worth it. So my tip is take time to do the important things. That spending time with family, building those memories, taking those pictures. It's really important. And we're going to remember that car show for a while. So as you're going through your scaling business and growing your business and dealing with all the headache of all the business, and Dave and I were just talking about how sometimes I feel so far behind on doing things. And like, I would feel like I always have to go back to work and work in the evenings and do stuff like that. Just remember to take time to do the important things of in life, like relationships, and take time to do that. So that is my tip of the week. So what's your tip?
So for anyone who follows things I'm involved with outside of this podcast, I do a lot of collaborations with a psychotherapist named Bill O'Hanlon, who is, I tell people when I'm explaining Bill to people, some people know, like, oh yeah, Bill O'Hanlon. Because he's been around as an innovator and teacher in the psychotherapy space for a very long time at this point. But for other people who aren't familiar, I usually begin by saying he's the most famous therapist I know. Bill's written and published over 40 books. He was a student in the 1970s of a famous psychiatrist and hypnotherapist, Milton Erickson, and Bill kind of made his early career as a teacher of Erickson's material. And Bill's, he was one of the co-founders of the solution-oriented approach to psychotherapy, to brief psychotherapy. And so he's in textbooks if you study family systems and things like that. And anyway, I've known Bill now for about a decade, a little over a decade at this point, and we've worked together pretty closely for a number of years. I took over with my CE organization, Psych Maven. I took over management of online courses because Bill's mostly retired at this point, but he likes to stay in it a little bit, and so we kind of have a partnership. And anyway, but that's kind of my life with Bill. But as I said, Bill's written lots of books, and he has one on his website for free. So if you go to billohanlon.org or billohanlon.com, you can go to either. It'll take you to the same place. You'll find on the home screen, it's at the top left right-hand corner. There's a opt-in form where you can get a PDF copy of. It's one of his favorite books of himself, of books that he's written, but it's called The Lazy Man's Guide to Success, and it's a pretty short read, and it's just sort of Bill sharing some things he's gleaned over the years, and um, Bill, I think has a history as probably a recovered workaholic.
Mm.
But I love watching his work rhythms now. He's kind of a sprinter when it comes to work. He and I just he put out a new course at the time of recording. We just finished launching it, but on trauma, it was a course that he had taught before over 300 times, but he never recorded it.
Uh,
And it was great training. I attended it live twice over the years, and I really pushed. I was like, Bill, you should do it. Please do it. And he did. But I knew when he was in a sprint, because I get text messages where he's with questions or updates, and he would just kind of focus in and get it done. And now he's down in the Caribbean at the time of recording, not recording a
good,
course.
good time to be during winter months here.
Yeah.
So he has that free book on, what was the webpage again? Bill O'Hanlon?
BillO'Hanlon.org or .com.
Okay.
Or BillO'Hanlon.com.
Great.
It's the go, but like that. It's a Lazy Man's Guide to Success. Free download on his website.
That's a great tip. Cool. All right. So, well, let's get into our topic for the week. We're talking about financial boundaries with clients, some policies and procedures to put into place. I can start with my first one, but David, you probably have more in place. But well, first let's start with this though. Why have set up boundaries with clients around financial things? What are some good reasons to do this?
Help scale.
To help scale?
That's kind of what we're about in this conversation.
Yeah.
We've talked about this in previous episodes, I think, but just there's a general discomfort that a lot of therapists have in conversations about money.
Yes.
And having good set policies, procedures, boundaries around these things makes what is a hard conversation for a lot of people a little bit easier. And it helps free up hard drive space in your brain to not have to think about this, because ultimately this is a side thing for what the relationship is supposed to be about. Now, depending on where you're working, how you're working, you may not have to have a lot of conversations about this. You may be in places where billing is, I mean, whether it's handled by non-therapists in a practice, which is just happens to some degree. I've worked in places like that. I've had friends that have worked in places that their funding structure is the clients don't, they're a Medicaid or grant funded organization. So there's no direct, there are money things, but it comes from third party entities exclusively. And so there are no direct conversations with clients necessarily about that beyond, what's your Medicaid information or things like that. So, but yeah, it frees up space.
Yeah, and I would also think having these policies makes the policies the bad guy, I guess, not the therapist. Like this is how we handle money. We handle it for everybody the same way. And so you don't have to rethink how to handle this sort of issue with like reinvent the wheel or redo the process every time. You have a process that, as you said, frees up your space so you can focus on therapy and the main reason people are coming in. Are there people that might take advantage of you? Is that another reason for having a financial boundary?
Sure. Or you will be disserving yourself.
What do
as
you
far
mean
as
by
the
that?
idea of yeah, as far as the first part of people taking advantage of you, sure. But in any situation, you're going to have that. And there are other people that won't. And
Right.
I don't want to talk about this and that the idea that the clients you're going to have are
Sure.
going to
Yeah,
be
yeah, yeah.
more problematic, but it will. But I think the bigger thing is something and it's an expression I gleaned from one of my long-term clients about being kind to your future self. So, if it was me talking about it, is I've got to think about what is going to make life easier or harder for future David.
Mhm.
and kind of embracing that, because part of not having these conversations is you don't want to have it because it's uncomfortable. But then what happens when you're dealing with late cancellations or no shows or a balance being run up? Then you've just created more work for future David or future James
Because you didn't want to have that
because you didn't want to
uncomfortable.
have that. And
Yeah.
so it is, to a certain extent, it's, the like the proverb, eating the frog. If you've got to eat a frog, go on and get it done. Uh, have you heard that one, James?
I think I've just heard about the boiling pot, the frog
No,
in the
that's a
boiling pot.
different frog metaphor. That's where I will slowly do that. But the expression is, if you've got to eat a frog, if you know every day you're going to have to eat a frog, it makes sense to do it first thing. And
I can
so
see
in
that.
in business and structure sorts of things, you talk about go on and get the frog eaten, like go on and eat the frog. Because there's this idea of like, this is not an appealing thing to do, but if you got to do it, go on and get it done. And putting it off, not having good structures or boundaries just usually means you're putting off problems. Sometimes there's wishful thinking. Sometimes there's the thought of, if I ignore this, it will go away or it will resolve itself. And every once in a while, maybe it does, but more often than not, no.
Great. Well, there's some things that we got to talk about, some policies that make it easier and help you set up some boundaries, financial boundaries with the clients. The first one I was going to talk about is, how do you get people to pay their copays and the fees ahead of time, even the no-show fees. And I learned this just by doing the virtual assistant company, is collect the credit card at registration.
Mhm.
Have the policy of collecting the credit card for the client on registration, where now if for their copays, it's on record, because one of the things the virtual assistants would had to do in an office that didn't do this is inevitably copays would get missed, or they didn't have it, or you know bill my card, and then they would bill the card after the appointment, after the client is gone, and
Mhm.
the card would get declined, and so then you'd have to track them down, or spend a lot of time tracking that down and then re-entering it, and people could have thousands of dollars in co-payments uncollected if they didn't get the credit card ahead of time. So I always love that tip: get the credit card at registration. That also prevents you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that can prevent some people from no showing the first appointment if they know that they're.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of that. I think with a lot of modern electronic healthcare record systems like therapy notes and other ones, oftentimes the credit card information is saved within it. That's a lot better. The issue of you got to think about how you're storing people's credit card information, because what happens in the system I use, that people save their credit card when they sign up. They do all their paperwork through their online client portal.
Mhm.
They save your credit card, but I can't access their full credit card information. It'll show me their last 4 digits and expiration. So I can't lift any info, because you gotta be careful about that as it relates to,
Yeah, that makes sense.
um and so, writing down their credit card number in their file, you need to have a more secure system than that. So there's that. So if you're using an EHR, that's a much easier thing to collect and save. And for me, like, people can't even request an appointment unless they file a credit card. And so we've kind of automated that process. Now, uh, going to the, does it how fees stack up? Like, yeah, that's a big thing. Like, if it's copays, that's one aspect of it. If you're doing a fee for service practice where they're paying for the entire session, that's even more.
Yeah.
Um, And make sure that whatever your system you have, though, works. It's because I'll give it an example. So my primary care physician, I've been trying to pay them for a few days, and they're making it too hard. So I've gone into doctor's appointments, and most of my doctor's appointments but like I see a lot of doctors in the same medical system, so it's all one billing thing. My primary care and some specialists I see all in the same, and I've got a balance at this point that I'm trying to pay, and they're making it difficult unintentionally. So I've gone into the office once and said like, "Hey, I think I have an outstanding balance." Like, "Oh, you just follow the link and pay online." And they do text me. They'd be like, "Hey, your bill is ready. Follow this link." Well, here's the thing. I go in to pay it, and then I get this error message. And I've tried it multiple times and on multiple devices. I keep on getting an error message. So at some point today, I'm going to go back to my primary care office and I'm like, "Hey, I have a bill to pay." And they might say like, "Oh, you should pay online." Well, I can't pay online. Can I just pay you? And my fear is I'm going to go to collections at some point, but this is not, I'm a good patient. I'm trying to pay my bill. But
Yeah.
all that to say is, if you have a system to save people's credit card information, make sure they have a way to update it. It's pretty easy if they need
Mm,
to, because I have long-term people that I've worked with that they just get new credit cards issued where it's a new
yes.
expiration date, and make it easy. And if you can't get mad at your clients if part of the reason that payment's not happening well is because you don't have a smooth system. If you don't have if you have people that are doing the check-in process, are they well trained, whether it's a virtual assistant or in-person receptionist or whatever? Are they trained to collect the payments or do the, because I'll go to my doctor's office. I'm like, "Hey, do I have a copay?" They're like, and they're not very focused on that.
So, um, so that's about collecting credit cards. I think at least having it on file saves a lot of problems, and you can use it as sort of a jumping off spot for some other policies that keep you from having to track down
Mhm.
the money. It is uncomfortable, It's you might not they might resist. Why do you need a credit card on file? But it's if you have it as a policy, we it helps you uh, collect those fees in the future. So future David doesn't have to do
Yeah, I
that
I wanna
work.
make life as easy as possible for future
Yeah.
David.
All right. So another thing is charging for filling out paperwork, and I've worked with some therapists who don't charge for paperwork, and then some who are like, I gotta start charging for paperwork. So um, what's the advantage of having a policy on some sort of fee for filling out paperwork, David?
Simply for that, it accounts for your time. I think the biggest thing is you have to have a policy. It has to be a policy, it has to be written. Um, you're it's hard to say you're gonna charge for something when it's not something, because it's part of, in some ways, an informed consent process and something that's big now in new in the therapy space of good faith estimates of
Yeah.
what are things gonna cost. So it needs to be part of, you have a policy, so you have something to follow. But it takes time. We have a $30 fee, I think is what it is currently, and it's based on units of time, but, like, it's a minimum of $30, but if it takes longer to fill out, then and that's related to things, just anything that's outside of normal therapy. We have policies in place. If, fortunately, we're not in settings where we have to do this a lot, but, if there's, like, something court related, if we have
Yeah.
to be like, how's that time paid for? How's that, and you need a policy in place of how that's gonna be accounted for. Um, because otherwise you could find yourself, you respond to a subpoena and you're waiting around to be deposed in a child custody case or something like that, and how you paid for that time. That's time that you can't see clients or, taking out of, your normal day, and how is that going to be in place? But it just do you there needs to be a way to account for your time, that what you do. Because one of the things I think you said in a previously recorded, James, is that it comes from somewhere. You're
Yeah.
stealing from somewhere, and there's no free time,
Right.
in that sense. It's either coming from yourself, or it's coming from your family, or it's coming from friendships, or it's coming from other relationships or places where you invest, your time either volunteering or being a part of, or other clients, but it comes from somewhere, from your sleep, from your
Yeah.
and sometimes we steal from different funds to kind of balance the sheets, robbing Peter to pay Paul, as the expression goes. But it can get really unbalanced if you do it too much, and if you assume that, like, well, this is just a way to account for that. And it doesn't have to be an exorbitant fee. You don't have to think about it as like, I'm going to charge huge amounts of money. But it also, when you have that fee, it encourages clients to think through their boundaries of what they ask you to do or not. Because there may be, I've gotten paperwork before where, like, it could have been mostly filled out by the client.
Right.
And oftentimes I have to go digging for information. I have to get into their file to figure out, okay, what's their date of birth, what's their, where other clients will, give me a mostly completed form that I just have to follow up with. So
I had a friend, this was mostly boundaries with insurance companies, but I had a friend, Ralph, who ran a department, and he was always saying the insurance company was giving us unfunded mandates where we had to keep filling out more and more paperwork, but they wouldn't pay you more for that. And I think if, the clients expect if they expect you to fill out the paperwork without a fee and there's nothing written down, it can be sort of like, well, why are you there can be that push pull. Why are you charging me for this? There's no, I only pay for therapy. So your time is valuable. I guess that's a main point to think about, that. Like, your time is valuable and you should be compensated for it.
Absolutely.
Another big policy that people talk about is a no-show policy. Do you want to talk about how you came up with your no-show policy and how you enforce it?
Yeah. We have, so they kind of run together. So we have a late cancellation / no-show policy.
Okay.
I worked at the counseling center I worked at before. It was, if you had a late cancellation, no-show, and late was anything under 24 hours from the appointment. And you think of the 24-hour, and that's a common one of what qualifies as a late cancellation or not. And you think about, so, James, you're a therapist and you have your day planned out, and let's say you've got, 6 sessions booked that day, 7 sessions booked that day. We'll say 6. And somebody calls that morning, and you have somebody you're supposed to see at 3, but they call at 10 that morning. And so they've called, it's not a no-show. They've called and said, like, hey, I'm so sorry, I can't make my appointment today. Well, the difference is if this is Tuesday and they called versus they called on Monday. On Monday, if they called at 10, you may have had time to then think about, like, oh, how am I going to account for this time differently?
Right. What am I going to do?
I may have another client that I can fit in this time, or hey, I can plan to run to the bank and get some errands done. But if it's in too tight of a time, you have less ability to have agency to use the time differently. You can't account. Someone calls me, let's say it's really tight. Someone calls me, 5 minutes before their appointment. That's still a cancellation, but I don't have a lot of flexibility what to do with that hour now. Now, if it's my last session of the day, then it's well, I'd go home early or something like that. But the absolute worst, you start your day. It's your first appointment of the day. You show up to work and you get in and you find you have a message. So they may be called the night before, but after you went home. And they're canceling, like, I could have slept in a little bit, or I could have, I could have not given myself indigestion by inhaling my Chick-fil-A chicken minis on the way in, or whatever it was that my morning looked like. And so it goes back to the whole thing. Your time is accounted for. It's not just that your time is valuable. That's something to get on a slight soapbox. I do get miffed because therapists will get a little high horsey about, like, my time is valuable. Yes, your time is valuable. Everyone's time is valuable to a certain degree. And so it's not that your time is not valuable, but so is everybody's. And I think there's kind of an elitism that can slip into some therapist speech, but I don't know. That would be a different episode of, like, therapist elitism. But but your time needs to be accounted for because it is your work time. The same that everybody's work time should be accounted for. And that's the issue with late cancellation. So anyway, going back to the policy. The policy was before 100%. I didn't like that. When I started my own practice, I didn't want to do that because I didn't feel, even though I couldn't use my time, I didn't feel I earned it quite that much.
So the policy, the previous policy was uh late cancel or cancel, what either one was on. They paid 100% for the
not normal cancel. If you canceled
normal.
in less than 24 hours, then there was no fee. And I do the same now because life happens. If people are
Okay,
responsible,
more than 24 hours. Yeah.
yeah, if it's more than 24 hours, then there's no penalty. And
Okay.
I will say, like, you don't want to do something like someone cancels 3 days before their appointment, you penalize them.
Yeah.
That's 24 hours is generally a good
Okay.
rhythm. If the only caveat I would say, if you're doing like a program, like it's not just an individual session, but like you've got a 3-day intensive you're doing, and that makes sense to maybe set like, hey, the boundary is you've got up to 2 weeks before the event or something like that. But that's a whole different can of worms. So we're just talking about normal therapy.
All right. So what's your policy now then?
If it's late cancellation or a no-show, it's 50% of the session fee. So whatever their session fee was, it's half. With the understanding, now that is the policy as it's written. The therapist, I do give discretion to waive that fee. It's still the policy, but we have informal procedures of how and when it's waived. For example, if an unexpected snowstorm happens, and I'll say, like, where I live in the world, it snows infrequently enough that no one knows how to handle it. Like we don't have like a lot of committed snowplows because a wintry winter for me is there's 14 days of snow on the ground. And not in a row, like just kind of throughout. And that's a pretty snowy winter for me. And so we don't have the infrastructure to handle that. People don't know how to. So if it's just not going to happen, and people get sick, like I'll oftentimes where someone, particularly in the pandemic years, I'll get a call from somebody an hour before their appointment and be like, hey, I just tested positive for COVID. I'm not going to charge that person.
Right.
Now, our policy still says you have this, but I'm not going to charge this person. And there's this idea of being able to extend grace to people. It's better, though, to have a harder policy in place and then extend grace than to have too loose of a policy. One of the things I treat it for people is everybody gets a freebie, that the first time it happens, to have flexibility, to have I also have a policy that if it's under 24 hours, but they can rebook the same week, we do not charge them. And the reason for that is because most therapists, like, their schedules are on a weekly basis. We see clients generally weekly, or even if we don't see them weekly, the week is still the unit. And so if you late cancel on Monday, but I had a spot open on Thursday that you can take, my income for the week is not negatively affected. So there are all these different caveats, but you want to find ways that kind of set that boundary. But that's if they call. Now, if it's no show, I'm less likely to give grace for that. Usually the policy is if they no show, call. My way of calling is, hey, James, this is David Hall with Haven. It's about 3:20. I had you down for a 3 o'clock appointment. Want to just check in to see if we need to reschedule or anything like that. I like putting it like that because I have no accusation. I'm just sharing information.
Why did you miss?
Why did you miss?
Why are you disrespecting me?
Yeah, I don't want to be passive aggressive about it. I don't want to be overly confrontational. That's the script I use, where it's I acknowledge, like, hey, like, I had you down for 3 o'clock. It's 3:20. Just want to check in, see what the deal. Like, let me know. Please call me back if you need to reschedule or whatever. If I don't hear from you, I will charge. If you call me and be like, I am so sorry, I've been in the ER, I've had, kidney stones, it's been, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll usually give that a pass. But there's a point where, if when somebody's had their, 8th grandmother pass away, it becomes
Yeah.
like,
So that's where I guess keeping records helps you if you record what the reason why.
yeah, I encourage a chart note. If most
Yeah.
EHRs will let you do that because it will show as like a cancel or late
Like an
cancel.
admin note or
Yeah.
something. Right.
To say
Yeah.
like, talk to client, they had this and, you can notice patterns, but better to have a pretty firm policy in place. And to something you said earlier, James, it allows the policy to be the bad guy or the center to be a bad guy.
Yeah.
And I'm the clinic director, but I'll reference the policies where people are like, why was I charged for this? I'm like, well, I'm sorry, it's the center policy for this. And I'll kind of act like I'm just this victim of it too.
Hmm. Well, in a
Sometimes I have
sense,
had,
the policies are for everyone,
yeah, and
they're
and
for the
they'll
boss too.
they'll ask me and be like, well, aren't you the boss? I'm like, I am, but I still got to follow the policy. I'm
Yep.
not above the law.
Not, yep. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I follow the same rules as the
Yeah.
therapist. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Anything else on no show? I feel like that could be a whole thing.
It's you figure out, you know, you got to think through. Some of it's your clientele, some of it's your of. I do think we have to have realistic expectations on what it looks like and what our policies are. For example, most of my clients don't use public transportation to get to me.
Mhm.
If they did, I would realize that there are factors that are more outside of their control,
Mhm.
and that becomes a you guys also have to think about it of what's allowed. Like, I can set the policy the way I do it because I have a cash-based practice.
Right.
How does it you can't bill insurance for a no-show. Insurance will not pay for that. And, and you can't bill, if you're doing Medicaid or something, you can't bill for that. And for most Medicaid systems, I think this works universally, the client isn't responsible for a copay. At least that's how it works in Tennessee. So there's no recourse for that. And so when I've worked with places that do very heavy Medicaid work, it's typical that double, triple booking is the norm because they're accounting for a certain amount of no-shows.
Mhm.
And the problem is what happens when everyone shows up.
Yeah, I was gonna mention that. I worked for a hospital system that did not, charge for no-shows. There was very little
Mhm.
anyone could do, money-wise anyways, for people who missed their treatment sessions. And I had a friend who moved to a cash pay office, and
Mhm.
he said their no-show policy, instead of having a third of his patients
Mhm.
not show up, he had, like, 1 a year or something, like, it was.
If you have a good no-show policy, it will help. I do also wanna be cautious as people are thinking about it, that you have to think of generally what sort of resources your clients have emotionally,
Yeah.
financially, things like that, and people that are more resourced in their life, will have more stability to show up and there's I think of one person I saw years ago, this was at the old counseling center I worked at. They would late cancel notoriously and had to pay the full session fee, but they were wealthy. They even said that. I wasn't the one calling. I had a receptionist that would call. Uh, and because this person would call like an hour before their appointment. They'd be like, "Oh yeah, I got distracted. My massage ran long," and the receptionist would say, like, "Well, you do know that there's," and they said, "Well, I've got plenty of money." And that was when I wished I could ramp up my fees to create more of a pain point for this person.
Yeah.
But for
Yep.
most of my clients, I'm expensive enough that there's a pain point, and so you wanna give yourself the ability to extend grace. You wanna be mindful of circumstances, but have the policy. You can't just make it up on the fly, and you've gotta think about
It's
how you're
really
enforcing it.
nuanced. Like,
It is.
"Oh, let's just have a no-show policy," but as you're talking, through it, there's a lot of things to think through to have a really good no-show
You've gotta
policy.
start with the policy.
Yeah,
And
start there.
you've gotta think about, I have a system there is nuance, James, but I do have a system of when and how we enforce it. And because you don't want it to be like, "I like this client, therefore I'm going to not enforce it," or, "I don't like this client, therefore I'm gonna
Right.
be hard."
Yeah.
You do need to have I guess the difference is that we have internal systems that we say, amongst the staff. It'd be like, hey, if they're ill, we're not going to charge for that because we don't want them to come in if they're ill.
No. Yeah.
And but we don't want to have that as a written policy because then it becomes the excuse of like, well, I'm sick. And then it becomes like, do we need a doctor's note? Like part of my policies for future, David, is I don't like any extra paperwork. This is a side
Good
note, but like,
policy.
yeah, we don't do a true sliding scale in our practice. Because if we did legally, we would need people to bring in proof of need of either pay stubs or bills or things like that. So we don't do a sliding because I don't want to deal with that. One, I think there could be a shame aspect for clients that can make them avoid it. So we do something different where we run a scholarship system, which functions similar to a sliding scale. But because we have it set up as a different mechanism, we don't have to do the paperwork of like, prove that this is, that you need this.
Prove that you're in need.
Yeah. And if we had a policy in place that said we didn't charge for no-shows if you're ill,
everybody would say they're ill.
Yeah. And do I want to follow that up? So
great. Okay. So maybe one other policy that we could talk about, and it's kind of related to these fees, is outstanding balances. What are some best practices for having a policy on collecting outstanding balances? This is really tricky because, as we talked in the beginning, you want to be the therapist, you want to have a therapeutic relationship. You don't necessarily want it to be all, you just want my money type of conversation. But, you pay for your staff, you pay for your lights, you pay for your building, you're paying for your education. So how do you have this policy or this conversation on collecting outstanding balances?
You have a policy in place. And another way to borrow a term that's common from the VA world of standard operating procedure.
Yeah.
And SOP, like what's the
SOP,
standard? Yeah. What's the standard operating procedure for this? So it depends on who's responsible. Like if you have administration staff or people that, and they're the ones that are handling balances and billing, then there's that. And how do they handle that with clients? And how do they communicate that to therapists in the ways that are necessary based on what's going on? Because there needs to be, if you have different people that are providing the services versus billing.
Okay, yeah.
You need to make sure that there's kind of understanding in that. Or if it's the same person, then again, what's the standard operating procedure? For us, therapists are generally managing their own schedule in my practice. And the rule we have is if once a client is has 2 sessions that have not been paid for, they cannot book again. And that can be dicey because my practice is in a university town. We have a lot of college students we see. And for them, it is oftentimes it's a parent's credit card on file, but these are legal adults. And so there's a dynamic about communication. So we can't necessarily call the parents unless we have release to say, hey, we need you to update the credit card. And so it becomes a conversation with the client, but it's not the client's direct funds. And so that becomes a thing. And so oftentimes that's where it can be, that pressure can be felt, but that's where it's having a policy in place. And because a therapist of mine will have to say like, hey, James, I'm sorry, I can't see you, because we've got, outstanding balances for 2 sessions. And the policy of the clinic is that we can't book any more sessions if that's the case. And it's who's staying on top of to know is there an outstanding balance. And again, in my practice, that's a therapist's responsibility, but therapists are paid based on money received, not money billed. And so that incentivizes therapists to note, have I
collected? Yeah, because they could be doing
because it affects their pay.
No money.
Yeah, it affects their pay. And I'll say we have a mutual friend who found out after he had let somebody go that he had somebody who had been getting paid for sessions, but who had not been billing. and it was like had not been billing. This therapist was responsible to like put in the bill, but had not been billing for months. And it was, by the time it was discovered, it was way beyond reasonable collection. And this therapist was getting paid as if they had
Yeah.
been billing. And
Oh man, that's like
yeah,
gut punch,
yeah,
heart falling down. Uh,
yeah. And
so
so
so you
what's your
have
system? Yeah.
how do you manage that? I guess do you have a report? I guess you
We have a
run.
report. Part of it is that we do pay once a month,
Okay,
and uh, and for payroll to be run, it's closing out the books for the month, which is something we do in our EHR. And when we're doing that, it can be seen of, are there any outstanding balances? And then that becomes a communicator, that gets communicated from, our clinic management to whatever therapist. But like, hey, your client still owes for such and such. And, what sort of follow-up conversation needs to have. Sometimes it's from the therapist, not always. Sometimes it's some of the management level. We don't have a lot,
sure.
but we'll do a little depending on what it is to say. Particularly if the client is not an active client, we'll take on that conversation differently. But you need to have a point where you can check in. And so for us, it's almost like we're doing a monthly audit of the books to see that. And if you didn't have a system like that, how long could it go before someone would notice?
That's scary because you don't always have systems until you realize you need the system,
Hmm.
right? And so the especially when it comes to money and billing and being able to pay people and pay your bills, uh, having that system in place that uses the report, that you have the communication in place, the therapists know their roles. I'm sure the clients, whether they read it or not, have a policy paper on what you do with the outstanding balances. So it's just a lot of communication just for this one, um, air quotes, little thing
Hmm.
to manage.
Hmm.
Have you, uh, so what do you think about your policy that you like, and what is something that make you think maybe could improve, or, you want it to be different, but it's not because of your policy. So what's the best and worst things about your policy?
My policy is very Mary Poppins, practically perfect in every way. It is. It is no, man. I don't have any. It's why it's my policies. I don't have because I could tell things about other people's policies, but there are structural things. Like I wish that it wasn't difficult. I wish that uh I wish a lot. I wish that counseling was easy to people for people to pay for, and and easy to provide. Like there's this tension of, because I do find myself having to explain to clients, like, why don't you take my insurance?
Mm,
And we have an FAQ on our website, and I direct people to, and part of it is there are lots of reasons. One is it would require more overhead to take insurance because I would need to have dedicated somebody to bill insurance, whether either that would be somebody that would be an employee, someone that was hired, or I would be a contracted service but it would
right.
cost in some way um, to do that. And reimbursement is less than what the market rate is for what we charge. If insurance paid well for this, if insurance paid just what they pay other people for the same service. I discovered this later, that for certain billing codes, if a physician is doing some of the billing codes that are common for therapists, they'll get paid significantly more, even though for what that particular service they are less qualified for. They're less
Mm.
qualified to do psychotherapy. But if they bill for some of those units, they get reimbursed at a higher rate.
Oh, wow. Doesn't seem
And
fair.
so it's but I think insurance companies are gauging, like, well, this doctor's probably not gonna bill a whole lot for that,
Mm,
and, we need to have them credentialed because it's this hospital system, and we have to, so it's and you're a solo practice or a smaller group practice psychotherapist, your ability to negotiate with insurance companies is necessarily great. And
So,
yeah,
oh, well, so what are some mistakes? But what wrapping up this discussion then, because your policy is perfect,
it's Mary
what
Poppins. It's practically perfect.
practically perfect. What are some mistakes people might make with the collecting or the outstanding balance policy?
Be too nice and be too mean. I
Be
see
too
people do.
nice or be too mean? Yeah, can you
Yeah,
unpack
well,
that a little
and
bit? That sounds
they're related to. Oftentimes,
yeah.
people will be too nice in that it's this idea of they're not being good boundary. They're
Mhm.
not having good boundaries as they're approaching it. They're not holding people accountable, and it's a lot of whenever you get a chance, whenever like this is
Yeah,
it's okay, it's okay. And then what typically happens for that? Here's the cost of that because someone has to pay for that, and here's how you pay for that. You're spending being nice in a very shallow, superficial, unhelpful way. And the bill comes due, and then you've lost your patience
yeah,
and you feel taken advantage of. And then oftentimes
yeah,
that leads to the flywheel catching. And then there's the other side, and then you're overly angry. And both being too nice and being too mean is different manifestations of being unjust to the client. You're not by being too coddling, that's not being very just. And
right.
being too confrontational, depending on the circumstances, is not necessarily very just. So how do you do this in ways that is balanced and just is what I think about. And having a good policy and boundaries in place where you're not being mean, you're being boundary. Now, some clients don't know how to distinguish that.
Yeah,
I have a very low value on niceness. I want to be kind, but kind and nice are not synonymous.
mhm,
Nice is a very superficial, shallow thing. It's not bad by itself, but it's not particularly deep. Because you can be kind to somebody that can look very confrontational at times, very firm, can look very not nice. To be truly kind to somebody. And there are ways that you're being nice, that you're being very unkind in your niceness.
right. It's not helping them.
Yeah.
It's yeah. I think I think the phrase that comes to mind is like tough but fair. Like
Yeah.
you have some firmness, but that you're also fair about how you apply it. So
Like I
being
said, I want to very much be kind to my clients, but part of
yeah,
kindness is manifesting good boundaries at the beginning.
yeah.
And I
Okay.
want my boundaries to be and so thinking about like here's an example of a good boundary. I say this to clients, and the same thing goes to policies. What is the policy that you can enforce regardless of your mood? That where it's still a good policy. Like this policy has to be a good policy whether or not you're feeling sympathetic,
Mhm.
feeling forgiving, whether you're feeling angry, whether you're feeling put upon, whatever your feeling is this a good policy? And it needs to be a good policy regardless of your mood. And that is a sign of a good policy.
Good. All right. So that's a good place to stop on boundaries with clients around financial matters. Great discussion. Let's go to our one thing you want people to take away from this episode. I'll go first. I think just value your time. Like your time
Mm,
is valuable, and uh, you doing things for people is fine and nice, but also there's a time where you have to say, I need to get paid for certain things like the paperwork or your no show or the cancellation type stuff. Like don't value yourself so low that you're not going to get paid for some of that work. So value
mhm,
your time is my
mhm.
one thing to take away. How about you, David?
Have it written down. Have a policy.
Have a
Like
policy. Yeah.
you've gotta you can adjust a policy until you get to the Mary Poppins level, as I said, but like you can uh it's not writing it in stone, but you have to have it down, and you have to have it down. It has to be understood by your clients and your clinicians if you're a group practice owner, because to make it up on the fly is not it's not good policy. You need to
No.
set it. You can adjust it, but you need to have something set.
Great. All right. Great advice. Great discussion. I think that's the end of this week's show. So for James Marland and Dr. David Hall, thank you for listening to the show. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to the Scaling Therapy Practice. I hope you enjoyed the show. I want to remind you that the content shared today is for general information and entertainment purposes only. It shouldn't be considered as legal or tax advice. If you need a professional advice in those areas, please consult with a licensed attorney or accountant. But thank you so much for listening. The Scaling Therapy Practice is part of the SciCraft Network.